jump into it. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining me today. And my name is Mark Phillip. I'm an application engineer with Studica Incorporated. Studica is a reseller for all sorts of software and hardware, and we primarily deal with schools in K through 12 and college in North America, and we also have offices located in several other parts of the world as well. We've been doing this for a little over 30 years, so we have a lot of expertise in the educational sector. So I hope that you learned something interesting today, and we will be talking today about using Babbel software to enhance your language learning program at your school, or to at least look at how it might be able to help you. I'm also joined by my colleague, Christy Leitner. She is the director of our marketing, and she's in the chat fielding technical issues you might have for me and hopefully fielding questions later. So if you need to contact me for any reason, my contact information is here on the screen in front of you, and our website is studica.com if you're interested in looking at what we have to offer. So with that being said, we're going to talk about a couple of things today. The first thing I want to look at is basically, why is language learning important? And some of the points I'm going to be looking at are the trend of the increasing number of bilingual speakers in the United States. We'll also be looking at language requirements at the collegiate level and what that means for both colleges and K through 12 schools. We'll also be talking about globalization and why that's basically driving demand for bilingualism and why that matters for you and your students. And I won't touch on it too in depth, but I want to make the point that there is a health and well-being aspect to multilingualism. Study after study has basically shown that people who are bilingual or multilingual have better attention spans, they're better at problem solving, and they are quicker to adapt to new information. There's also some evidence to suggest that bilingual people show a later onset of Alzheimer's and dementia, as well as a reduced risk of such diseases. So there's a lot of interesting research in this realm. If you are interested in that, I recommend looking into that on your own time. But I do want to mention that because a lot of what I'll be talking about is related more to the education aspect and kind of the job aspect, but not so much the health aspect. So on the first point, one of the really interesting trends currently in the United States is the increasing number of bilingual speakers. What this data from the Census Bureau is showing us is basically the population of people who are 5 years or older who speak a language other than English at home. And we have data from 2010, 2015, and the projected data for 2020. Basically what we're seeing is just a steady increase, and these numbers are in the millions. So when we look at the linear graph and we see that there's 67.3 in 2020, that means 67.3 million people. That's roughly over a fifth of the population of the United States. And the point here is that there's going to be this increasing number of people who speak multiple languages, and this is going to in part drive a increased demand for people to learn these languages so that they can better communicate with their friends, family members, colleagues, and their peers. And it's going to help your students as they, if your students are learning this other language, it's going to help them better navigate both their professional lives, their personal lives, and potentially their educational lives as they find themselves surrounded by more and more people who do speak multiple languages. It's going to help them, navigate an increasingly globalized world as well, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So on the point of language requirements, what the Modern Language Association found recently is that approximately 50% of higher education institutions in the U.S. have a language requirement to actually graduate. Essentially, that means that you have to have taken some kind of language class to actually get a degree. And so why does this matter for, say, K-12 schools? Well, the big point here is that if you want to prepare your students for, their academic life in college, for those of your students who are going to college, if you get them started early with language learning, they're going to be in a better place to succeed in their academic life. And study after study has shown that the younger you start learning a language, the easier it is for you to adapt to and actually retain that information. It does get more difficult the older you get. So if your student's first exposure to a second language is when they're 20 years old in their sophomore year of college, they're going to be at a bigger disadvantage than the student who maybe started in 6th grade. And for colleges, this is important to know because you have to be thinking about, what's an effective solution for us to be providing for our students and what makes sense for our faculty as well. So this is an increasingly popular trend, and they expect this number of 50% to actually go higher as time goes on. What this graph is showing us is basically the percent of institutions that have developed some kind of international or global learning outcome. And this is across all these different degree types. So we can see that basically across every degree, there's an increasing number of requirements for language learning. And this is just between 2006 and 2011. That's just a 5-year gap, and I haven't found more recent data than this. But we are seeing this increase even at the associate's level. So even just to get a 2-year degree from a college, there's 46% of institutions in the US are basically requiring you to take a language course. So let's look at globalization and job prospects. Before I jump into this, I want to just make a note about what globalization is, because some people may not be familiar with the term. The idea of globalization is basically the idea of the world economy and the global market and the breaking down of trade barriers. So essentially, it's the idea that we now do business on a global scale, that almost every country has like a symbiotic relationship with other countries. And this is largely driven by emerging economies and these booming GDPs of these emerging economies and countries such as the United States and businesses in the United States taking advantage of that to increase their own business. The result of this is that we're seeing an increased number of jobs that are looking for bilingual employees. And this demand for bilingual employees is spread across all types of jobs, not just low wage or not just high wage, but your lower class, middle class, upper class. All these kinds of jobs are now increasingly demanding bilingual workers. And what this data here is showing us is the number of online job listings for workers with bilingual skills between 2010 and 2015. In a 5-year period, we see over a twofold increase, I should say, from 2010. There are other factors that could be affecting that, but in general, the trend is suggesting that there's a lot more demand out there for bilingual workers. And this is only looking at online listings. We don't see things such as internal listings for a corporation or local listings that may not be digital. And this demand is largely driven by emerging economies. And so in the United States, for instance, if somebody wants to do business in another country where they dominantly don't speak English, they're going to want workers who know how to speak that language and workers who know how to navigate the cultural norms of that country to basically effectively make business transactions. What these graphs are showing us on the left here is we have the change in share of jobs targeting bilingual workers between 2010 and 2015. And this is organized by what they call prestige. Prestige is basically a measurement of how people perceive specific jobs, right? So an example of this would be your lowest prestige would be, Your lowest prestige might be, say, like a fast food worker or something, right? A job that's not really considered too glamorous, whereas your highest prestige might be like a surgeon or a doctor. So that's kind of how prestige is measured. And what this graph is showing us is how this demand for bilingual workers is basically being spread across these different prestiges. It's not entirely equal, but the trend here is that across all prestiges, there is an increased demand. So, it's not that none of these prestiges have a zero increased demand. It's that every one of these prestiges are looking for more people with bilingual skills. The figure on the right is showing us the employers with the largest share of bilingual listings as of 2015. You'll notice most of them are pretty much Fortune 500 corporations, banks, insurance companies, and mobile data carriers. And the numbers kind of speak for themselves, but the idea here is that many of these companies are now doing a lot more business in these countries where their economies are merging due to basically a modern industrial revolution. And so there's a lot of money to be made in those economies, and so the banks and insurance companies are jumping on that. And as a result, they need people who know how to speak that language and navigate the cultural norms of those societies. So the upshot here is that your students who are prepared with comprehensive language learning and can actually speak these languages, they're going to be in a better position to find work and probably get paid more. I don't have exact stats on that, but I've read that bilingual workers in general do make more money on average in their salary than a monolingual. So there's a lot of prospects there for your students, and preparing them for that future is really important. So now we've kind of talked about, the factors driving language learning in the modern day. Let's look at some of the trends that are being adopted in the education sector, at least based on the research that I had done. Kind of the big ones I found were blended learning, language immersion, and distance learning, which is kind of coupled with blended learning, and we'll talk about that. So language immersion is an approach that's increasingly being used in the United States. 448 schools are using it currently, based on the data I had found. And here, the Center for Applied Linguistics put this graph out that basically shows the growth of this approach in the United States. From 2006 to 2011, we've seen almost a 2 times increase in this approach because it's been found to be highly effective. It's also largely used in a lot of European countries where bilingual education is very important over there. And one of the most effective ways they've found of teaching it is through language immersion. So this is a really popular approach right now, and it has been highly effective. And the general idea with language immersion is that when you're in your class, you're basically speaking the language that you're trying to learn, and there's almost no native language being spoken for you. It's kind of the approach of throw you in the deep end to see how to teach you how to swim, sort of. That's not to say that your instructor won't help you if you're struggling. Obviously they will, but the idea is that you learn better by being surrounded by the language and by being forced to use it in conversation. So this approach doesn't look at memorization so much. They look more at, how do people converse with each other? What kind of things are they talking about? And, so your average day, if you go into a language immersive class, is that you might be talking to classmates for a large part of your class. You might just be talking about, what did you eat today? Who did you talk to? What fun things did you do over the weekend? So there's a lot less focus on memorizing words and definitions. And the idea is that you'll learn those words and definitions just by using them and speaking them. So this is a very popular approach. We'll talk about how this fits into the software aspect a little later. Blended learning is an approach that combines distance learning with face-to-face learning. And the face-to-face instruction could be done pretty much however you want it to be done. But the key component here is that it's like a hybrid approach where you might spend 1 day a week inside an actual classroom, and then the rest of the time you take your coursework online. So an approach like this really necessitates the use of some kind of language software when you really break it down. What's interesting with blended learning is that it's something increasingly requested by parents and students. And this is largely because of the flexibility, right? So when you have distance learning, you have this really flexible schedule available to you where people who might be busy with jobs or work or have, other responsibilities they have to take care of, blended learning provides a much more flexible option for them. It's also generally cheaper for the schools to provide because they no longer have to provide facilities for, say, 30 students to come into every day or every other day. So maybe 1 day a week, 2 days a week, they come into the school, use the facilities, and then the rest of the time they're doing everything online. I won't go through all the stats here, but basically what they're saying is that students have increasingly favored the distance learning approach or approaches that use some form of distance learning within them. And most students actually report that they feel they learn better this way and that they retain more information. They're actually more likely to do their coursework. parents of students also express a similar sentiment that they favor these courses, that their children seem more engaged. So this is also a very popular approach currently, especially in the collegiate level, I believe. And on the topic of blended learning, we'll look at distance learning a little bit more, because there is also the idea that you have entirely online classes where you actually don't meet at all. So that's a little different from blended learning, because distance learning says this is going to be done 100% through the internet. So some of the stats I found were that by 2019, at least 50% of college classes are expected to be delivered online. That's pretty enormous, and I think that's largely being driven by rising tuition costs and the student debt crisis that we're currently in. Colleges are looking for ways to basically lower the cost of tuition, and a great way to do that is through online courses, because the cost of providing such courses is really cheap. You no longer have to provide facilities and infrastructure for 40, 50, 60 students to come into a lecture every other day, right? Now they just connect through the internet at home or in the library or whatever they might be doing, and that saves you a lot of costs for the school, which in turn can drive down tuition costs. It also frees up the instructor's time and allows the instructor to perform basically simultaneous classes for a large number of students. At the K through 12 level, we are seeing a bit slower adoption to this approach, at least in the public sector. I can't speak necessarily for private schools. I have read that private schools have been pretty quick to adopt to distance learning, but public schools in K through 12 have been a little bit slower to adopt, and I'm assuming that this is due to just the rules and regulations that public schools have to follow. You know, they can't just quickly make this big sweeping change without going through all the proper channels. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just is what it is. But we are seeing more and more schools in K through 12 also attempting to adopt at least some kind of, whether it's blended learning or full-on distance learning, they are trying to adopt these programs. And I've seen this a lot with schools using like Chromebook programs, right, where they allow students to take Chromebooks home with them and things like that. So we are expecting to see increased distance learning as time goes on. And this approach does, like I said, it necessitates the use of language software to basically be able to accurately provide a comprehensive language program. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the approaches, let's talk about the program that we're looking at here at Studica, which is called Babbel. Babbel's an online language learning platform. It's also a mobile application. It's highly portable, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's heavily used in education. It's focused on building real-life conversation skills. So kind of like I talked about with the immersive environment, where we're looking at conversing with people, not memorizing. Babbel's focused on that. They want you to be learning phrases and words that are, going to be relevant to you actually speaking with somebody, as if you're in that country talking to someone, right, who's a native speaker. It uses your native language to basically help reinforce the language you're attempting to learn. So basically, I speak English, and if I'm taking a Spanish class, it will be showing me definitions and phrases in English, but also showing me the same thing in Spanish, and basically trying to make that connection for me. And it focuses on all skills of language, which would be listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And there's 8,500 hours of content in 14 different languages. And before I talk a bit more about how this is useful in education, I want to just kind of show you the platform a little bit. So here in my browser, I'm on the Babbel homepage, and I want to note that this is the same across every device. The fact that you just access this through a website makes it highly portable. So if you had, say, a Chromebook or like even a Linux computer, like something that generally doesn't run a lot of popular software, as long as you have a browser and an internet connection, you can get here and use the website. So I'm currently logged into my account, and this is my homepage. It's basically showing me where have I left off, what have I been doing. I'm in the Spanish course currently, and it's telling me that I can pick up where I left off. It shows me my current score and like how far along I am in my current course, which is a beginner's course because I barely speak Spanish. And if I wanted to look at some of the courses they have, I can click the courses tab, and it will basically show me all their different options here. So we have new courses, which is basically new content that's been created recently. And then there's beginners courses. We have grammar courses that are focused on reinforcing proper grammar. And we have intermediate courses that focus on the listening and speaking aspect, courses that focus on countries and traditions. So this might be more related to cultural aspects, or the conversations and definitions might be more related to things you might find within that country or among the group who speaks that language. There's special courses. There's also courses focused on words and sentences. I'm going to go into the beginners course because that's what I am, a beginner. And here in beginners course 1, I have this little green dot here indicating to me that this is basically where I've left off. This is where my progress is. And there's a number of beginners courses, and each course contains a number of basically lessons. So we see in beginners course 1, I have, I don't know, like 20 plus lessons in here. There's a lot. So I've done the first course. It's got a check mark next to it indicating that I finished it. And then, so maybe I want to do course 2. So I can click on start, and it's going to ask me if I want to use a microphone or not. I will go ahead and do that. So you can kind of see the phonetic and listening aspect and hear how bad I am at pronouncing Spanish. So once I click continue, it's basically going to, what you'll see is there's going to be a native speaker who says a phrase. So I listen to that phrase and then I have to repeat that phrase. And then it's going to analyze what I say and make sure that I'm using the correct pronunciation, as well as that I'm actually saying the right words. So if I click continue.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. Okay, so that's the general idea. There's kind of 3 levels of reinforcement here. So we actually have the visual aspect with the image. And so the images are supposed to be related to kind of the phrase that you're talking about, right? So mucho gusto being it's a pleasure, shows like 2 people meeting each other. See you soon is like 2 people shaking hands like they're leaving. Good morning shows you a picture of like, morning fog in some meadow somewhere. So the idea here is to kind of reinforce through both visuals and written language, as well as the hearing aspect, to understand what all of these phrases mean. And I do want to reinforce that the people who are speaking the words to you, they are native speakers, so they actually have a proper accent and pronunciation, so that you can try and cater your accent and pronunciation as well as you can to theirs. So then what they also asked me to do on this next part is choose the correct translation for mucho gusto, which would be it's a pleasure.
Mucho gusto.
And then hasta pronto is see you
Hasta
soon.
pronto.
Buenos días, good morning.
Buenos días.
And buenas tardes is good afternoon.
Buenas tardes.
And you'll notice every time I click it, they're still reinforcing the hearing aspect, right? So they keep saying it at me so that it gets hammered in my head eventually that this is how you say it. This is, the right way. Then there's the written aspect. So how do you say it's a pleasure? That would be mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
And they do these little kind of buttons here because on the mobile app, it looks exactly the same. And on the mobile, since you have a touch screen, it's a lot easier to just use these to fill it in, but I'm on my computer, so I'm using my keyboard. Good morning would be buenos días.
Buenos días.
And then it's going to be buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
And then that's done. And then this is one of my favorite ones is there's this complete the dialogue. It's kind of like you have a text message conversation with someone, right? And so it's, fill in, how do you say good morning? I say buenos días.
Buenos días, Carlos.
And then somebody else responds, good afternoon, Jorge, it's already noon. How do I say good afternoon? Buenas tardes. And what's interesting with this one here is that I've not learned anything about this phrase, ya es mediodía, but they still throw it at me and show me the definition. So they're kind of getting me started on future lessons right now, even though I haven't, say, memorized or been learning those phrases yet.
Ya es mediodía.
And I also hear them speaking it. So again, they're reinforcing the pronunciation aspect.
Sí, ya es tarde. ¿Y usted es?
And then she is my wife, say ella.
Ella es mi esposa.
then hola, then I am be yo soy.
Hola, yo soy Claudia.
And this kind of goes back and forth a little bit, and then it's a pleasure be mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Yo soy Jorge.
So again, the idea here is that
Encantada.
they're trying to reinforce like an actual conversation, right? You're not saying, I don't know,
¿Hasta
I've used
cuándo?
some language apps where you get phrases like the blue dog is on top of the tall table, right? It's kind of a ridiculous scenario, and it's not very realistic.
Ciao.
But when you have stuff thrown at you in this more kind of relatable way, it becomes easier for you as the learner to relate that to your own life and better understand that information. So then there's other sections like in here where they start talking about, say, feminine and masculine nouns or present and past tense and things like that. And so they do focus on all these aspects of the language. And I don't want to spend a whole lot more time through the demonstration just because I want to be able to get everybody out in a timely manner here. But there are 4 more slides here that I would go through that kind of reinforce the same thing and also try to reinforce grammar beyond just definitions or conversation. So I can also review everything I've learned. So I can go to my vocabulary tab and it'll basically show me a list of everything I've learned through all my lessons so far. I've only done like 2 lessons, so I only have about 8 words here. But for instance, thank you is gracias, and I can hear
Gracias.
that verbiage. I can hear that on any of these. So ciao,
Ciao.
yo,
Yo.
tú.
Tú.
And I can kind of reinforce all this for myself. I can also choose to review these items. So I can choose review now, and I can choose the way I want to review them. Do I want to review my like reading and writing ability, or would I want to focus on my listening and speaking, right? Or maybe I want to focus on memorization. I can do that. I can use flashcards. For this, I'll go ahead and do writing. And basically, at this point, they test me on it. How do you say thank you? It's gracias.
Gracias.
How do you say bye? It's ciao.
Ciao.
How do I say I? It's yo.
Yo.
And this just goes on for all the words that I selected to review. And once you're done, it will basically tell you which ones you got right, which ones you got wrong. And in that way, you can kind of focus on the areas where you might be lacking or the parts that you're struggling with. Again, I won't go through the whole thing. But that's kind of the gist of it. That's, yeah. So there's courses for more than just what we see here. And let me open this up. And hide. There we go. So how Babbel gets you to mastery is basically they have courses designed for every level. What you saw there, I just showed you the beginner's course, but there are intermediate courses and there's also grammar courses. And the grammar courses can even be useful for native speakers. It seems, at least in my own experience, a lot of times, even people who know a language really well, grammar is where they can get tripped up. And so even for a native speaker, being able to reinforce proper grammar can be really useful for you. Also with Babbel, when you first start using the program, it will test you and basically find out, where are you with the language. In my case, I was really bad at Spanish, so they told me to start at the very beginning. But maybe you're an intermediate user, like you actually know quite a bit of Spanish. You might be tested and they might say, well, we recommend you start in the intermediate section. And that's not to say you have to follow that pathway. It's just that the program itself is trying to help start you on the right foot. So why is Babbel effective? I talked about some of this earlier, but probably the big one is the dialogue is relevant content. And as we saw with kind of that dialogue back and forth that we had with Jorge and Carlos and Claudia, we kind of get this idea of, hi, how are you doing? I'm doing good. It's a great day. Oh yeah, that's my wife. Say hello, sort of thing. It's not, like I said, there's some of these apps where you get the blue dog is on top of the tall table, and it's, what am I supposed to do with that? It doesn't make any sense. The idea is that you're actually learning conversations and getting these ideas reinforced that if you were to go to that country or talk to somebody who speaks that language, you might actually use that knowledge and be able to carry on that conversation. Another effective aspect here is that the lessons are all voiced by native speakers. And I mentioned that while I was going through it, but all those voices you heard are native speakers. Like, that is their first language. And so they do have the proper accent and pronunciation. And so you, as a speaker who that is not your native language, it's helpful for you to try and figure out how you should be pronunciating. So the review sessions also help you to basically focus on the aspects or the, say, words and phrases, definitions that you're not very good at, or that you might be struggling with. So you can go back and review them and make sure you understand the pronunciation, make sure you understand it when you hear it, make sure you know how to read and write it. And all the lessons are roughly 10 to 15 minutes. And this is a really important point because almost all the modern research is suggesting that to actually learn a new language, you only really need to do about 40 to 45 minutes a day. And what's nice with 10 to 15 minute lessons is that can really fit into a busy schedule very easily. It's not a huge time commitment for you to just boot up a lesson and go through it. And even if you're not feeling confident about that lesson, you can always go back and review those words that you learned and make sure you reinforce that. And again, the content's all relevant and the application is highly portable. And this is a big deal for education where you're going to have a lot of students with competing platforms. I mean, you might have a student with a Mac, somebody's got a PC, someone might have a Linux box, another person might have a Chromebook or whatever. Maybe they don't even have a computer, they just have their smartphone. It doesn't matter. They can use it on any of those devices, and that data will be synced across those devices. So in the education section, one of the biggest reasons that educators choose Babbel is because of the price, as well as its ease of use. It's pretty much plug and play. You get the license, you go to the website, you can start using it, and it's very straightforward. It's cheap, and a lot of people might wonder, well, like, why wouldn't I use a free language app? And there's numerous reasons there. For one, the ads. Okay, so I don't know how many people have used any of the free language apps. I've used a couple myself, and the ads are pretty intrusive and very annoying, and you have no way to control those ads. In, public K through 12 schools, that can be a big problem where you don't know if you're going to see potentially an offensive ad or something explicit that you would rather your students not be seeing, which could cause, a big problem for the school itself. Beyond that, a lot of the free applications that you'll find out there have user-generated content. So really anybody can be creating content for those apps. And the results of that is basically you end up with a really inconsistent pathway to learning. Like, you might be in a beginner's lesson and you're doing some beginner words, and then the next page might be something really advanced out of nowhere that you've never seen before. And it becomes hard for you to really draw the parallel between what you just learned being like a really basic introduction to this more advanced, phrase or sentence that's being said. So there's really no quality control. There's no way of really knowing what content is being created or, whether or not that content's even going to be effective. Another issue I've run into with some of the free apps is the paywall. So even though the apps are free, they still do in-app purchases, right? And so the way they get you with this is that they'll give you like 5 lives, right? And if you miss a question, you lose a life. If you're at 0 lives, you can't even answer a question. They won't even let you continue, right? The option at that point is you wait 30 minutes for a life to replenish, or you pay them $2 to get your life back. And so it's like, well, your students aren't going to get everything right 100% of the time. So what happens when your student loses all 5 lives and now they're actually blocked from learning anything for the next hour, or if they pay $2, right? And so it turns into something like you're going to pay for it if, you're either going to pay for it or you're either going to be prolonging your learning in that situation. And Babbel doesn't have any of that involved. You pay cheap up front and you don't get ads, you don't get the paywall, you don't get the in-app purchases. And you actually get content that's created by professionals and native speakers and people who know what they're doing. Again, and another reason educators like it is, like I mentioned on the last slide, the portability aspect. You're going to have students who have a variety of devices, some students who may have very few devices. And the fact is, as long as they can get a connection to the internet and a browser that they can go to the website, they'll be able to use it, and they can sync their progress among any of their devices as well. Another thing is that Babbel is useful for all the current learning trends. So in the immersive environment, what we're concerned with is how do you keep the student kind of immersed when they go home, right? And that's pretty much impossible. You can't necessarily, enforce that. But what you can do is try to give them meaningful homework assignments. And part of that would potentially be giving them, a program like Babbel and having them complete a lesson or two and be graded on that. Because you can't guarantee that they're going to go home and speak Spanish to their family who doesn't speak Spanish, right? It just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So you need something to keep them going when they're not in class for that hour and a half every other day. In the blended learning environment, it's important that we have some kind of solution for the distance learning aspect. And software is an incredibly important part of distance learning. And having a solution like Babbel makes it much easier for you to provide that sort of distance learning in a meaningful way and give them comprehensive language education even when they're not in the classroom. Okay, so with all that being said, for the people in attendance today, we do have this offer currently for a free personal copy of the software. This is essentially a personal copy that you can use for yourself that lasts, I believe it's for 6 months. I don't want to be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure it's 6 months. But basically, those of you here right now, if you want to take advantage of this, you can email our marketing department at marketing@studica.com. And in the subject line, put this right here, BAB free. So BAB free is your subject line. Yes, it's 6 months. Okay. And we'll provide you with instructions basically on how you can get this license. So our idea here is that we're going to give you this totally free personal license that you can use for yourself and see if you like it, see if it's if you think it's something that you can work into your classroom and your curriculum. And that's for those of you who are here right now. And again, I'll leave this up a little longer so that if you're interested, you can go ahead and fire that email off right now. Email marketing@studica.com. Use BAB free as your subject line. And again, we will contact you about that. I'll leave it up here for about 20 more seconds, 30 more seconds. And I'll also, once I'm past this slide, if you need me to go back to it for any reason, I can do that. So, okay. So at that point, I'll open it up for questions. I'll try to answer them the best I can. I cannot guarantee that I'll have answers for all of your questions. But if you have any questions, what you'll want to do is use the chat menu on the Join Me bar across the top of your computer and talk. And it looks like my chat is already blowing up. So let me look at what I have here. With the free 6-month trial, can we request any level? Okay, Christy looks like she's already been answering a bunch of questions for me, which is helpful. Thank you, Christy. What fully online curricula does Babbel offer? Chris, you do know an answer to that off the top of your head? What fully online curriculum does Babbel offer? I'm going to look at some of these earlier questions real quick and just review them. So there is no current curriculum. Okay, we have some, okay. I'm looking a little far back in my chat here. Question, are these courses connected to the ACTFL standards? Christy's going to look into that for you and be able to get back to you. Okay. Does it account for regional variations such as Caribbean Spanish? It doesn't cover Caribbean Spanish, so some of the regional variations don't exist currently. We do know that they are working on more and more languages. We just don't know exactly what at the moment. Hi, regarding Spanish, it is mixed with both Spanish and Latin American Spanish in the lessons. Does Babbel integrate into an LMS like Blackboard or Canvas? Babbel's working on an LMS system, and we do not at this moment believe or know if it will integrate with a system like Blackboard or Canvas. We'll know more once they're closer to that launch. So Marcus says, so Babbel would be a supplement to another curriculum that our district has already purchased. I mean, I guess it just depends on how you want to incorporate it. But yeah, I mean, in general, if you have some curriculum that you're already focused on, then yeah, it would basically supplement that curriculum. Also, I don't know if I'd mentioned this. Someone had asked, with the free 6-month trial, can we request any level? Yeah, so you can basically use any level of like the language learning. It's like a fully featured license, so you should be able to access everything on the site. Any other questions? I do also want to note that we'll send a follow-up email to everybody who attended, and with some further resources if you're interested in any extra information. Also with contact information for us if you do have questions that you might not have gotten answered here, questions that you thought of afterwards. We'll also have a recording of the webinar, so if you need to show this to anybody else or if you want to review something, I'm recording it currently and we'll have it up on YouTube. So I'm not getting any more questions, so I'll go ahead and go to the last slide here with contact information. There we go. So that's our website, studica.com/Babbel/for-education. Or you can just go to Google, type in Studica Babbel, and you'll find our Babbel offerings on our site. We also have a really good sales staff who knows, honestly, they probably know more than I do about some of the questions you might have. So if you want to contact them, you can reach them at sales@studica.com. And you can also call us, 888-561-7521. We're available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, that's Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And like I'd mentioned, we will send a follow-up email with more information and a video recording if you need that for any reason. So with that being said, I do want to thank you all for showing up today, and I hope you all have a great Valentine's Day and rest of the week. Thank you very much.